platform for us, and students can access it really easily through a Chromebook, which is a pretty game-changing device for us because it's so easy to have them log in. And then all of that is student-facing. But I think what really makes that work is what's happening behind the scenes. And it's the type of data that we're getting out of those programs and how we can visualize it. So new things like Schoolzilla, that's really working. Illuminate, so it's real-time data and kind of checking for understanding in the moment, allows us to continually better individualize that student's day.
So, Wei, there seems to be an emerging trend of startups that are developing technology to take over the lower order tasks for teachers, like quizzing and remediation and things like that. It seems like this would have a big impact on public school education. When will this kind of technology go mainstream, and what kinds of effects do you think we would see in public schools?
It's interesting. I was just talking to Tim. The first cohort of Imagine K-12 was maybe 2 years ago. And if you call out two of the companies, Remind 101, which was text messaging to parents, and Class Dojo, which was basically a point system for behavior, they were both identified as these point solutions, and people did question the scalability or the consumer effect, the teacher, kind of the bottoms-up consumer adoption. Today, there probably are top two EdTech companies in terms of usage. So to the extent that I think with any, EdTech is not a new market, it feels like it over the last 5 years, you're going to have almost the lowest hanging fruit in terms of tools that are built. But I think what's differentiating the top entrepreneurs is being able not only scale, but to think about the long-term vision of their products. And when I think about Sam in Class Dojo, I think about character development and what he's doing in terms of not only managing day-to-day behavior, but how we even think about other characteristics to measure students on outside of just academic standards. And in the case of Remind 101, you have such a huge both social and economic impact on being able to reach huge populations of parents who have never ever been able to communicate with their students in the classroom or teachers in the classroom as we did in the past. So I think for some companies, looking beyond the point solution and seeing the bigger picture is probably the big differentiator, both as an investor and an entrepreneur, and being able to identify that.
Yeah, no, I love both of those companies. I love Class Dojo because, 20 years ago when I was in elementary school, it was the card system, the pull your cards, very low tech, very, very ancient, and very inefficient. So, Tim, of the startups that graduate from Imagine K-12, which ones are going on to raise VC funding? And what are they doing? What are they actually addressing in the education market?
Maybe the way to think about which ones are getting funded, because in my mind I separate out VC funding from angel funding, and the majority of what's being funded these days is by angels. So out of all the teams that come through our program, roughly 70% get kind of follow-on funding, most of that from angels. Only 9 out of the 38 companies from our first 4 cohorts have raised a Series A or later. So roughly, maybe almost a quarter are getting money directly from VCs. And it's probably an easier answer or a shorter answer to say what's not getting funded by VCs. And that's the business as usual within education, a product that you have to sell through the superintendent's office that requires a long pilot, some testing, and then 18 months later you get to the sale. That's not being funded, right? That's been going on for a couple of decades, and we all know on this panel that doesn't produce kind of innovation. So the kind of things, and we talked about Remind 101 and Class Dojo here, taking advantage of the fact that 10 years ago not every classroom was connected, and now we can distribute products directly to teachers and have them test it. Not necessarily, and they don't have purchasing power, but they're in front of 30 kids every day. So they have testing and usage power. So using that fact, using what's new there to design new business models, as Wei said, being thoughtful about the future and how does something evolve. So some of the things getting funded are things that reach scale, don't necessarily have early revenue, but are in hundreds of thousands of classrooms and have very compelling leaders that venture capitalists kind of can entrust with coming up with a business model in future years.
That's interesting. Why is EdTech largely funded by angels rather than VCs? I didn't know that. That's kind of surprising to me.
Well, I think it's not just EdTech. It's kind of startup worldwide, if you will. The cost of starting at least on the software side, hardware, it's a whole different world. But on the software side, it doesn't take a whole lot of money to fund a startup and to test an idea. And so I think a lot of what's going on in the Valley is angel-driven. And if you're, in some circumstances, if you're successful, kind of VC is that next phase of development.
Interesting. Gregor, you hold 15 patents ranging from mobile to security technology. So this is kind of a departure for you, education and online learning. What made you go this route? What was missing from the online learning field?
Well, it was quite interesting. I sold my previous company, Zone Labs, 7-8 years ago, stayed on for another 2 years, and then I had, for the first time in my life, some idle time, and I wanted to learn something. I'm a high school dropout, so I didn't have a lot of education prior to that. And I wanted to do online courses. It was a normal thing to do. And I was actually shocked how bad online courses were. And it wasn't the creators of the courses. It was just the overall quality. It didn't do any of the things that a computer is really good at, which is really engaging you, being interactive, if you drawing you in. All the things that the game's gotten right, the online educational industry had wrong. And so we started analyzing a little bit more why is that the case. And it turned out that you really had only one of two choices. Either you build a very simple course that has maybe some videos, some text, a quiz, and call it a day, or you go the full custom route. That means you hire 10 developers, build the whole thing from scratch, and obviously in many cases that's not financeable, particularly when you move towards a long tail. So we came up with this idea, we're building this course creation platform, and it became quite clear from the beginning that if we limit the, for lack of a better word, language of online learning to our own creativity, if we decide, okay, well, we want to have a game like this, and we want to have a chart like that, and so on, we would lose. So instead, we build a complete open platform where any developer can add this, what we call learning gadgets, these small little pieces of code in there, and then a teacher can customize those. So that could be, for example, a timeline. So somebody writes a timeline gadget. In many cases, we have right now 700 developers in our pipeline waiting to actually develop on the platform. And we're going to open the platform up completely at the end of this quarter. But somebody writes a timeline gadget, and then a teacher or an author can then use it and say, okay, well, I'm going to put here the different events in the timeline, I'm going to put some graphics and videos in. It becomes an interactive element, but you don't need to know any programming, you don't have any kind of in-depth knowledge of computers, really. So anybody who can do a PowerPoint can create a virtual course.
So I'm interested in how K-12 teachers will be able to use Versal. Usually when people talk about online learning, they're talking about college courses and massive open online courses. But more teachers are flipping their classrooms, using online lectures at home and then having students discuss them in the classroom. And do you see that being a big part of Versal's future?
It was actually a big surprise for us. We kind of were initially addressing a lot of the publishers and larger publishers and stuff like that. It turns out the platform is easy enough for an individual teacher to just put together a little course. And that has fundamental effects. One of the things is that actually online learning then for the students becomes much more locally relevant. So instead of having some kind of large picture of biology I don't know, ferns, you can actually have something that's relevant that deals with the local fauna, the local animals, whatever you teach. So, and the other thing is that, I mean, we all had teachers who come into the classroom with a handout and say, hey, listen, do textbook chapter 1 and 2, ignore chapter 3, have something much better that works much better in our context. And they can build that as a virtual course, and then at the same time flip the classroom. That means they can spend the time discussing things in the classroom, but the students can actually learn quite a bit of that at home. It was a great experience when my daughter came home the first time with actually the homework as part of a virtual course. The other thing that happened, which actually is even more exciting, is that we see a lot more teachers experimenting with student-directed learning. That means they say, let's say, how does a cell consist of? Group A does this part, Group B does that part, and so on. And the students themselves build together a course on the biology of a cell, for example, and they actually get graded not only how well they do their part, but how well others learn in the part that they actually created. It's a really, really cool model and really an engaging model. And it's really all about using online to actually engage the students more, as opposed to kind of like we're trying to save some cost here.
So, Chantel, EdTech funding has exploded in the last 2 years. In 2013, VCs invested $616 million across 115 deals, according to the National Venture Capital Association. Now, by comparison, in 2008, EdTech startups raised $260 million across 55 deals. So that's a pretty big jump. Why the push into EdTech now?
So it's a confluence of factors, and there's a few macro trends as well as a couple of shifts in the education system that we can point to. So first, interconnectivity is definitely getting better. It's definitely not where we need it to be, but as Tim pointed to, it's a lot easier for teachers and students to get the tools that they need. We're also seeing an increase in the penetration of tablet devices, and so these devices are getting out there, and so you're starting to see the possibilities of EdTech becoming a reality. The other thing we're seeing is that, excuse me, so right now about 40% of teachers are under the age of 30, so a lot of them are digital natives. They're using consumer technology in their homes and now want to bring it to their classrooms, and so you have these teachers really embracing technology for student learning. Another shift that we're seeing is with the upcoming Common Core. We're seeing that there's a need for uniform standards, and now developers and designers can basically design to those standards. It's a lot easier to design for one standard and not multiple standards across different states. There's also bigger demand now with Common Core for more rigorous digital content and more rigorous digital assessments. The last piece I'll point to is just an interest from the consumer technology space. So we're seeing big companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft come into education and having very specific education strategies. So even today, Google just announced their classroom product, which is going to be a teacher-student interaction tool. We're also seeing a lot of talent from the consumer technology space coming into education, which is really helpful.
Very cool. So now, what about profits? Public school dollars are already stretched pretty thin, and 40% of public schools are considered low income. So how can EdTech startups, specifically those that cater to K-12 schools, how can they make money and scale effectively?
Yeah, so as we know, education is a difficult market. There's a couple strategies that we're seeing right now that are showing some promise. So one strategy is to look at the different federal funding sources that you can use for your solution. So with the example of low income, there's a lot of Title I funding out there that companies can tap into to help pay for their solution. We have a company called Goldbook who specializes in special education students, and another company called Elevation who's working with English language learners, and there is funding directly tied to those populations, and so they can tap into that funding in terms of having schools pay for their products. The other interesting model we're seeing is one of our companies, Bright Bites, is actually leveraging a channel partner. So they're working with educational service agencies, and what this allows them to do is sell at more of the district and state level and not sell school by school. And so with that model, they've been able to grow to almost 10% of schools within 2 years. And then I just think with growth and scale, so we talked about Remind 101, we talked about Class Dojo, those are already reaching millions and millions of users, and so just thinking about how do you now monetize those users, whether that's monetizing through premium products or monetizing other groups such as parents. I think there's another strategy.
So now I want to talk about results because education is always results driven. We're always asking about results. Last month, a study came out of Westchester University, and you guys might have actually seen this in the New York Times. So this study found that students' reading comprehension scores were actually lower when they read ebooks than when they read traditional print books, and that was primarily because they tend to skip over the text and go right for the interactive games and features. So it kind of made me wonder, are we jumping too readily at the idea of technology as a savior for K-12 education? And how do we separate the good ed tech from the bad ed tech? And that's for anybody. Anybody can answer. Or I can pick one of you.
Well, it's actually interesting that you mentioned that study, because what the study really says is that students like interactive, interesting elements. And so the question is more like, why are these textbooks structured in a way that there has this really boring text part that you have to kind of suffer through, and then you get a little bit kind of entertaining graphics, and then you get more boring text part, and so on. Aren't these books created in a way that they're way more engaging than they would be, which you can do? Why are there not assessments in between, say, hey, make sure that you read through these parts, and so on? So it's really, I think it's a little premature to say it's the technology that is the fault, but it's the way the technology is applied in this specific case. And what happens a lot, particularly with textbooks, is a lot of textbooks got taken from the printed form and translated into an online form directly without any kind of filter, without any kind of modification. And it's a very, very different medium. That's kind of like I'm doing your radio talk show on TV. It becomes pretty boring TV.
Let me just add that I caution us all to use EdTech's the savior of our schools. We don't think like that at all. There is no silver bullet to fixing our schools. Technology is not that. It can help, right? There is no scenario that I can think of, or that when I work with teams, we don't imagine, where the teacher isn't the center of a classroom. That needs to continue. Technology is really to support what the teacher's doing, and if you just look at what
Absolutely.
Rocket Ship's doing, right, it's based on that. And what they do is they optimize teachers' time, right? And so, over the last few decades, we have put more and more compliance on schools, and usually that ends up on the teacher's desk. And there's only so many hours in the day, and when you ask a teacher to do more and more, at some point, what gets taken out of her day is teaching. Right? And a lot of what you're seeing with the EdTech right now is putting time back in her pocket to prepare and or to teach. So again, it's not the silver bullet, but it certainly can help, I think, a system that has been inefficiently run, if you will. It can help it run more efficiently than it has been.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes down to the implementation and making sure that teachers have the right supports in place to implement the education technology tools. And then in regards to your question of the good ed tech and the bad ed tech, actually teachers are really good at identifying the good ed tech, and we usually rely on teachers for a lot of the feedback. You can look at teacher adoption, you can look at their satisfaction, and get an indication of what's really working. And so we usually use teachers' feedback as a leading indicator of what's working.
I would just also add one thing about how students are using those e-readers, and I think we're watching that in schools and really trying to identify like the pros and the cons. And the pros of these e-readers are so high in terms of all students being able to access the same text at a different level and then have a classroom discussion. That's something that you couldn't do with a paper book. And so I think there's certain pros and cons that teachers are realizing and leveraging, and they've been harnessed. And it's just about application of the tool and in what way.
Mm-hmm. So, Tim, what about personalization? We're always talking about personalization in education. What does that mean, and where do you think it's going?
I think it's early days. When I hear personalization in EdTech, I really just think engagement, right? If you look at what a teacher is tasked to do, she sits in front of 30 students, all with varying ability, some on, some very bright and wanting to be pushed, and some take a little bit longer to learn. And so personalization should help kind of engage all students at the same time, so they're all moving as actively as they can. I think sometimes the notion of personalization is oversold. I think I helped create My Yahoo back in 1995. and we all had all these dreams of what personalization on the web could be. And a lot of those things that we talked about way back then still aren't realized, right? And that's in the consumer web space, where there is no gating item. I think schools will be even slower to adopt. So, in terms of true personalization, where the computer is 2 steps ahead of the student, I think we're a ways away from that. And I think an admirable goal is to help schools run more efficiently and engage all students so they can become as good as students they possibly can and not be bored in any way in class.
So what are you excited about? What do you think will be the next big thing in EdTech? And I'd like to hear from all of you on this. What will be the next big thing in EdTech? Oh, okay.
Just real quick, one of the things I'm excited about, well, there's 2 quick things. One, peer-to-peer learning. I think we haven't seen, there's a lot of potential there, students giving each other feedback. There haven't been a whole lot of great tools developed yet, but I think there will be in the next little while. And the other, and maybe this is just me as the parent speaking, is the communication between school and parents can be, and we talked about tools already doing that, Remind 101 and Class Dojo. I think there needs to be a continued push on kind of making school less of a black box to parents so they can engage constructively for students. And I think that's a very kind of a doable task, if you will, for tech.
Yeah, if I would add one is allowing teachers to become part of a lot of the EdTech and not just consumers, to be able to create things with them, to modify them, to play with them, and to not, okay, well, here's EdTech and you sit on the sideline and watch your students, but really be part of the process of creating the content for educational technology.
So I recently have been skewed more towards special education and early childhood, and I'll plug the 2 companies, Locomotive Labs and Kid Admit, who are presenting here at Vator. I like domains that have had historically very limited entrepreneurial activity. I actually think in these 2 domains, the propensity to pay is actually higher among special educators and parents who are highly engaged users. And I think if you care about learning outcomes, this is why I'm in the work. I look at specifically around early child development and special education in leading the path to general ed. It's funny, special education has been tracking individual learning plans, which is basically personalization, call it, when it was federally mandated since 1975. So I think the analogy would be the design thinking analogy and looking at extreme users. And if you look and support learners on the learning spectrum on the extremes, I think there's a lot to be learned in general ed. And I think my 4th area of interest right now, as probably everyone in this room, is the DIY maker movement. I think it's going to transform both hardware and software in and out of the classrooms in the next few years, and so I'm a huge proponent also around more experiment-based learning models. So those are the rough areas I'm looking at now.
So I would say one area would be gaming and using the power of games to really engage students, and also using games as a way to assess students. We just actually partnered with Zynga.org to start a gaming accelerator, Co.Lab, which is looking at basically getting more education gaming companies out there. The other area I would say is just, I guess, tools that will help with metacognitive skills. So not a lot of tools right now are focused on either persistence and grit, and these kind of other character skills that we know students really need to succeed.
And I think I'm excited about 2 things. I think a lot of our houses, or the students that we serve, actually just still don't have Wi-Fi, and so a lot of the solutions that we're coming up with and the content that they experience in school, they don't have access to at home, even though we've built this amazing platform for them to get it. And so I'm really excited about mobile solutions and some of the ways that we're able to now put our content and communicate with students who can use their parent's smartphone from home to practice. And I think the second thing I'm really excited about is just how much better data application is getting. So out of the back end of all these different programs, the data and what it means, we're able to use it in a lot more strategic ways, and I think that's only going to improve so that we're going to be better and better at using this data and predicting sort of what the student needs and further individualize a student's day based on all of the sources of data kind of coming together.
Wonderful. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.